What would you do if your HOA president tried to hand out your private cabin like it was community property? That Saturday morning, I found out the hard way. I opened my front door that Saturday morning, expecting the usual sea breeze and silence. But instead, I found three strangers dragging lounge chairs across my beachfront porch while one of them sipped wine straight from the bottle and asked if the grill had been preheated yet. My first thought was that I was being pranked. My second was that maybe I'd missed a rental listing gone rogue. But then I heard her voice before I saw her. Karen Lancaster, the HOA president, in her oversized sunglasses and sun hat, waving like she was running a resort instead of hijacking someone's property. She pointed at me like I was the hired help and barked. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. My guests are getting restless. Would you mind unlocking the cabin now so they can change and freshen up and maybe pull out the folding chairs from the back, too?" It took my brain a full 10 seconds to register that she had apparently given away my private beachfront cabin to her out-of-town guests without my knowledge or permission and expected me to cater to them. When I said no flatly and with escalating confusion, she laughed and said this was all part of a new community engagement program she'd proposed at the last HOA meeting, a program I'd never heard of, approved in a vote I'd never attended, and one she insisted passed unanimously. I told her the door would stay locked and that these people were trespassing. She scoffed and pulled out her phone. 2 minutes later, she was calling the sheriff and reporting that I was locking residents out of a shared facility in violation of HOA unity protocols. As one of her guests started spraying tanning oil all over my deck chairs, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was war. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up within 20 minutes, which was faster than usual for our sleepy coastal town, and I wasn't sure whether to be relieved or insulted by the speed. Deputy Marsh stepped out with a look of practiced neutrality, but shot me a small smirk as he passed. Clearly used to HOA dramatics, Karen practically ran to him in her wedge heels, flailing her hands and going on about how I'd recently become combative, unstable, possibly suffering from coastal isolation rage, a term she apparently invented on the spot, and that I'd locked her and her guests out of a facility paid for by everyone. Marsh turned to me and said, "Let me guess. She thinks your house is community property now." I nodded. He sighed. I handed over the deed, complete with surveyed lot lines and a 1998 document stating in bold that the structure and beachfront access were private, exempt from shared use under a grandfathered agreement long before the HOA even existed. Marsh read it, nodded again, and walked back to Karen. He didn't arrest anyone, but he did suggest they vacate the deck and maybe find another place to sunbathe if they didn't want to test the boundaries of trespassing laws. Karen stormed off, barking into her phone and saying she was going to fix this. The guests left, grumbling, one of them kicking over my citronella candles on the way out. I watched them go, knowing this wasn't the end. By the next morning, an email was sent out to the entire HOA listserv announcing a special emergency community meeting regarding the clarification of shared amenities and their purpose in fostering neighborhood unity. It was clearly about me. The language was careful but loaded. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later, and within hours people began whispering about property access disputes and non-compliance issues. I got a text from my neighbor Paul down the street, a quiet retiree who never attended anything HOA related unless it involved trimming his hedges. He asked if it was true that Karen had tried to seize my house. I told him yes, more or less. He didn't respond with words, just sent a single laughing emoji followed by a gif of a dumpster fire floating in floodwater. It didn't comfort me. On the day of the emergency meeting, the community center parking lot was full, which was rare even during the annual budget vote. I walked in and immediately felt the eyes. Karen stood at the front in a bright yellow blazer, holding a stack of papers and speaking in her falsely upbeat tone about the benefits of unity and equal enjoyment of beachfront spaces. When it came time for the real issue, she brought up a recent incident in which one member's private interpretation of community property disrupted planned hospitality efforts and created tension among guests. I raised my hand and asked if that was her way of saying she handed out keys to my house and called the cops when I didn't comply. Some people chuckled. Karen didn't. She said this was exactly why we needed better clarity in the HOA bylaws about what was and wasn't considered shared space. I pointed out that her argument made no sense unless we were now calling every home in the neighborhood a hotel. She rolled her eyes and invited a vote on a temporary resolution to allow HOA management authority over underutilized beachfront properties for communal enrichment. The vote passed 11-6 and Karen smirked like a queen who just won a minor battle. But I didn't flinch. I pulled out a thick manila envelope from my backpack and calmly handed it to the HOA secretary. Inside were not only the original lot surveys and grandfathered deed exemptions, but also a notarized letter from the developer who built my cabin. His statement confirmed that my property had been explicitly excluded from all future HOA administrative access. The room went quiet. Karen's face changed instantly. She tried to recover by saying we would need time to verify the document and that misinformation was dangerous. I pointed out the notary stamp and signature dated just last month. She paused, then moved to adjourn the meeting abruptly, citing a scheduling conflict. As people began to file out, I caught a glimpse of one of her guests from that chaotic Saturday, the same man who'd spilled wine on my porch, arguing with her in the parking lot. He looked angry. I couldn't hear their words, but his gestures were wide, accusatory, and his face looked red with embarrassment. Later that evening, I received a quiet knock at my door. It was my neighbor Paul. He handed me a small folded note. It was from one of the HOA board members who had abstained from voting. The note said, "I think you should know Karen is planning to push a retroactive amendment at the next meeting. She's claiming you misled the board about your property status. Watch your back." That night, I sat on my porch, looked out at the empty beach, and realized this wasn't about rules or unity. It wasn't even about the cabin. It was about control. Karen didn't just want access. She wanted ownership of the story, the neighborhood, the optics. And if I didn't stop her now, the next thing she'd be handing out was my bedroom. So, I decided I'd fight this her way, but smarter. If she wanted to drag the HOA into legal nonsense, then I'd give her a front row seat to what happens when the real paperwork speaks. But first, I needed leverage, and I had a feeling Karen had a few skeletons stashed behind that designer smile and those HOA newsletters. By the time the weekend ended, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and the beach was no longer just sand and sea. It had become a battlefield lined with suspicious glances and whispered speculation. Some people who once nodded politely when passing my driveway now walked by without making eye contact, while others gave awkward thumbs-ups as if they were trying to say, "Hang in there," without picking a side. Karen, on the other hand, had entered full campaign mode. She began circulating glossy HOA newsletters detailing a new vision for community engagement that sounded suspiciously like forced participation wrapped in passive-aggressive smiles. Every paragraph hinted at unity, accessibility, and the shared joys of coastal living. But it was impossible to ignore the underlying implication that private property was now a selfish indulgence, an obstacle to progress, and apparently a threat to the social fabric of the neighborhood. Her language became more inflated with each message, referring to herself as community liaison, hospitality director, and steward of neighborly balance. I might have laughed if I weren't aware that some people were actually buying into it. I received a formal notice taped to my mailbox, a printed document with HOA letterhead announcing that my property would be the subject of a special review to determine whether it fell under updated shared access guidelines pending legal clarification. There was no such clause in the bylaws. I knew it. Karen knew it. But she was counting on confusion and intimidation to cloud the facts long enough to gain traction. So I started digging, not just into property documents, but into Karen herself. It started with a casual conversation with the town clerk, an old friend of my father's who still remembered when my cabin was one of the only standing structures on that stretch of coastline. He confirmed that my property, due to its age and original deed, had been grandfathered in with an ironclad clause protecting it from any HOA claim. But more importantly, he casually mentioned that Karen hadn't always lived in the neighborhood. In fact, she'd moved in only 3 years ago after selling her previous home during a scandal involving a community garden budget gone missing in her last HOA role. That one sentence sent me down a rabbit hole. I pulled property records, scanned old neighborhood newsletters from her previous community, one called Pebble Hills Retreat, and even found a cached version of their HOA meeting notes archived in a real estate forum. What I discovered was damning. Karen had been involved in a series of misappropriations and had stepped down just before formal investigations were launched into HOA spending irregularities. One of the newsletters had a veiled comment from a board member thanking her for her unmatched enthusiasm despite the occasional accounting hiccup. Another entry described a vote to eliminate the treasurer's discretionary fund following concerns about purchases that couldn't be traced. It didn't take much imagination to fill in the blanks. Armed with this knowledge, I began assembling a binder. I wasn't looking to start a war. I wanted to end one, but I knew Karen wouldn't stop unless she was exposed, cornered, and stripped of her influence in front of the very people she sought to impress. The problem was timing. Her next move came faster than expected. 2 days later, I woke to find orange flags and white spray paint markers dotting the edge of my property. Confused, I followed the line all the way to the sand, where I found a small wooden stake with a laminated notice declaring the start of a community coastal beautification initiative, which would include the installation of shared benches and a temporary walking path that just happened to run through the eastern edge of my deck. I didn't even get the courtesy of a letter this time. She'd skipped straight to visual propaganda, hoping the sight of city-colored flags would make the whole thing look official. I took pictures, then I made some calls. The county planning department had no record of any beautification project filed under my parcel. In fact, the person I spoke to said they'd never received a request from our HOA for any communal project approvals in months. I sent them the laminated notice I'd removed from the beach, and they confirmed it was a violation of code to suggest a public work project without county oversight. They thanked me and said someone would be in touch. That gave me just enough time to prepare for the inevitable showdown that Karen didn't see coming. 3 nights later, under the salty breeze and orange-pink sky, the HOA held another meeting. This one promoted as a vote to solidify coastal shared access zones and streamline neighborhood harmony initiatives. It was held in the same community center where Karen had once made a group of retired veterans recite a pledge to the HOA before approving their garden shed paint color. I walked in holding my binder, not with swagger, but with cold resolve. Karen greeted people like she was hosting a yacht club brunch, calling neighbors by name, offering wine coolers and mini crab cakes from a rented catering tray. When I arrived, her smile thinned but stayed glued in place. She greeted me with a cheerful but strained hello, then called the meeting to order. She began with a long-winded speech about the power of community and the importance of accessibility and how exclusive access to key locations created division. She built up to a proposal for a policy shift, one that would allow temporary access grants to private properties deemed historically connected to the shoreline, a ridiculous stretch of language that she claimed had precedent from other HOA models across the state. Just as she moved to open the floor to questions, I raised my hand, holding the binder. I asked if she was aware of the legal consequences of enforcing policy based on fraudulent jurisdiction. Her brow twitched slightly. I asked if the community had been informed that no permits existed for the so-called beautification initiative and that presenting false notices violated county code. She tried to cut me off, saying the matter could be discussed privately. I ignored her and began distributing copies of my findings to every board member in the room. The silence grew heavier with each page turned. One of the documents included screenshots of the financial discrepancies from her last HOA stint pulled from archived meeting notes and local watchdog blog post. Another contained a signed statement from the original developer of my cabin confirming its HOA exemption, notarized and dated. But the one that got the biggest reaction was the image of the laminated flag post on my property, contrasted against the official county response, labeling it unauthorized and misleading. Karen's jaw visibly tensed. Someone from the back of the room asked, "Is this true?" Another board member whispered something and flipped the page quickly. Karen tried to redirect the discussion, saying it was all being taken out of context and that we should focus on the broader mission. But by then it was too late. Her charm had evaporated. The board began murmuring, then debating. A vote was called to table her motion indefinitely. It passed. Karen stood still, her carefully controlled persona cracking just slightly at the edges. She muttered something about lawyer involvement and stormed out, leaving behind a half-empty tray of crab cakes and an even emptier room of confused but now skeptical neighbors. I didn't gloat. The neighborhood was no longer the quiet postcard perfect coastal retreat I had moved into years ago. It now buzzed with tension hidden behind manicured lawns and tightly drawn curtains. Karen had gone quiet for 2 days following the community center ambush. But that silence was deceptive. People like her don't retreat. They plot. And sure enough, the calm snapped on a Thursday morning when I received a letter slid under my door, one that wasn't postmarked or folded, clearly hand-delivered. It was printed on thick HOA letterhead with bold phrasing about an upcoming vote to amend the bylaws under emergency community provisions. The language was polished, vague, and clearly engineered by Karen herself. According to the document, the amendment would redefine access rights to certain properties with historical proximity to public spaces and community view lines. In plain terms, she was trying to use visual access to the beach as an excuse to regulate land that had always been private. She had found a new angle, one that sounded civic-minded on the surface, but was designed to seize control under a legal technicality. The vote was scheduled for the following week and would be conducted digitally with a short review period and no open forum debate. It was a maneuver designed for speed and confusion. And I knew exactly why she chose it, because she was losing support and needed to push it through before people had time to read between the lines. Later that afternoon, I walked down the road to Paul's place, knocking on the old driftwood frame of his front door. He looked over his glasses when he opened it and muttered that he'd been expecting me. He already had the letter in hand. We sat on his porch and talked in low voices as if we were being watched, and honestly, we probably were. Paul told me something that added fuel to the fire. A friend of his who worked in IT support for the HOA's web services had mentioned that Karen had changed the digital voting platform settings days earlier, limiting visibility of who had voted and adding a temporary proxy option that allowed certain board members to vote on behalf of residents who didn't respond in time. It wasn't illegal, but it was highly manipulative and the kind of thing that could go unnoticed if no one was paying attention. Worse, Paul suspected that some residents didn't even know a vote was happening. Karen had staggered the notifications, sending physical letters to some, emails to others, and skipping entirely those she thought wouldn't resist. She was staging a silent coup by exploiting apathy and confusion. I spent the next 3 days knocking on doors, not with paranoia or anger, but with calm, deliberate intention. I brought copies of the amendment letter, highlighted the vague language, and explained what it really meant. Some neighbors had no idea what was going on. Others admitted they'd assumed it was just a clarification vote and hadn't planned to respond. A few were still loyal to Karen, either because of her charm, their lack of understanding, or the small favors she handed out over time. Flowerbed competitions, dog walking committees, and invitations to wine tasting events on her deck. But more than a few began to see what I saw. By Sunday evening, I had enough concerned neighbors to agree to a special town hall, one outside of HOA channels. We booked the old firehouse conference room, sent out flyers ourselves, and held the meeting under the banner of property rights awareness. It wasn't a protest, it was information. The room was half full, but the mood was electric. I presented everything clearly. Karen's manipulation of the vote, her previous history at Pebble Hills, the fake beautification project, and now the new angle involving visual access, right? I kept it professional. I didn't insult her character, just showed her actions. Then came the twist. A man named David stood up from the back row and said he had something to share. He was one of Karen's out-of-town guests from the beach incident, the man with the wine bottle. He looked uncomfortable but resolute. He explained that he had no idea the cabin wasn't part of the community property when he arrived. Karen had told him it was a guest house for special visitors. He admitted he felt uneasy at the time but trusted her because of how confidently she presented it. Then he said something that made the room collectively lean forward. He worked for the Office of the State Property Registrar and had reviewed HOA-related disputes before. He had looked into our community records after that day, partly out of guilt and partly out of curiosity, and confirmed what I already knew. My property had never been under HOA jurisdiction. He even offered to write a formal statement as a public official. The room went silent, then erupted with questions, shock, and exasperation. Even some of Karen's quiet supporters looked rattled. I thanked David and promised his statement would be used only for transparency, not retaliation. We ended the meeting with a vote to draft a counter letter, one signed by over 24 residents, to suspend the digital vote and request a full HOA board review with neutral third-party oversight. We planned to deliver it 2 days before the vote deadline. What we didn't know was that Karen had anticipated a reaction and was already trying to get ahead of it. That Monday, an email blast went out to select residents with Karen's signature and a new message. It claimed that misinformation was spreading about the amendment and that certain individuals were trying to scare the community with fear tactics and incomplete documentation. She positioned herself as the victim of a smear campaign and urged voters to confirm their choices quickly to ensure the neighborhood isn't hijacked by those resistant to progress. I wasn't surprised by the spin. What surprised me was what followed. That evening, I came home to find a city-issued notice stuck to my door, an order to halt any structural modifications until further review, citing an anonymous complaint about potential unauthorized deck expansion and zoning encroachment. I hadn't touched my deck in 3 years. This was a precision strike meant to distract and stress me out right before the vote. I took the notice straight to the zoning office the next morning. The clerk there, an overworked woman named Teresa, remembered me and helped expedite the review. Within an hour, she confirmed the complaint was baseless and likely retaliatory. She even noted that the complaint form had been submitted from a community login that matched the HOA's internal access code. I didn't need her to say who submitted it. The final piece came that night when Paul knocked on my door again and handed me a flash drive. He said the IT guy, after hearing about the town hall, had finally decided to share something he had been holding on to. It was a copy of the back-end activity logs for the HOA voting system. On it, I found that several proxy votes had been activated automatically by Karen's admin account on behalf of residents who hadn't even opened the voting email. It was enough evidence to warrant a full digital audit. I printed screenshots, compiled everything, and prepared for the next HOA meeting. This one unmissable, unavoidable, and destined to be volcanic. 2 days before the scheduled vote, the atmosphere around the neighborhood shifted from quiet disapproval to something bordering on anxious curiosity, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air feels thick and charged. But no one wants to be the first to mention the lightning. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. The buzz had spread beyond the beachfront lanes and into the inland cul-de-sacs where residents who normally didn't bother with HOA politics were now whispering to one another over fences and porches, asking if the rumors were true. Karen had been seen pacing in front of the clubhouse on her phone, gesturing wildly, her usual calm replaced by the brittle energy of someone losing control, but too proud to admit it. Her newsletters were getting longer and more desperate, packed with exaggerated promises of a unified coastal paradise and vague warnings about misinformation campaigns led by disruptive influences. She even added a section titled "Setting the Record Straight," where she addressed in abstract terms the fake news surrounding her leadership and accused certain residents of twisting documents for personal gain. It was the political equivalent of plugging a leak with duct tape and hoping nobody noticed the flood in the basement. But people did notice, and they were beginning to ask the right questions. The next escalation came in the form of visitors, unexpected and poorly disguised as innocent guests. One morning, I looked out my window and saw a pair of 20-somethings with vlogging gear standing on my property line, panning cameras over my deck while loudly discussing the ethics of beachfront privilege. One of them even narrated into a mic, explaining that this was a classic case of a private landowner hoarding views that rightfully belonged to the community. I stepped outside, asked who sent them, and got vague shrugs and mumbled mentions of public interest, and Karen told us this area was disputed and needed exposure. I told them to leave. They didn't. I told them they were trespassing. They said they were standing on sand and that the beach was public. I pointed to the property marker, not 6 feet from their feet, and handed them a copy of the official survey, which they refused to even glance at. I had to call the sheriff again. It was the 3rd time in a month. The deputies arrived, recognized me immediately, and walked the influencers off the property while trying not to laugh. One of them, the older deputy, shook his head and muttered that I should start charging a tourism tax. I didn't laugh. The joke was too real. Later that evening, a video from the same pair showed up online under the title, "Local Man Denies Public Beach Access. Gatekeeping Paradise." It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. The video was edited with dramatic music and out-of-context clips, painting me as some cranky recluse barricading a vital community resource. But here's the thing. Sometimes when you try to shame someone publicly, you end up drawing attention to the very details you were trying to hide. Within 24 hours, the comments section turned against the video. People who actually lived in the area or understood property rights started asking for proof. Maps receipt. One commenter who claimed to be a retired land assessor pointed out the telltale signs of a privately deeded parcel. Another said they recognized the HOA president's voice in the background off camera, feeding the influencer's lines. By the end of the day, the video had been ratioed and quietly pulled down. I saved it anyway, just in case. Karen must have realized her narrative was falling apart because the very next day, she played her boldest card yet. An emergency digital vote update was issued stating that several proxy ballots had been consolidated for administrative efficiency, a move allegedly approved by the board under temporary voting acceleration rules. The timing couldn't have been more obvious. She was trying to lock in results before the upcoming meeting where everything would be laid bare. I immediately reached out to several residents listed on that proxy tally. 3 of them told me they never authorized any proxy representation. One of them hadn't even opened the original voting email and was stunned to hear her vote had been counted. That was the final straw. I compiled the statements, screenshots of back-end voting logs from the flash drive Paul had given me, and a printed list of all irregular ballots submitted under Karen's admin ID. I handed them off to an independent legal consultant who lived 2 neighborhoods over, but had volunteered to act as a neutral mediator once he caught wind of the situation. His name was Victor, and though he wasn't loud or flashy, he had the calm confidence of someone who had taken down larger egos in larger boardrooms. He read through the evidence, looked up at me, and said, "You don't need to fight her. You just need to let her finish destroying herself." The morning of the HOA meeting arrived and the community center looked like a political rally crossed with a courtroom. More people showed up than I'd ever seen at a neighborhood event, some standing outside the doors because the room had reached capacity. Karen was already at the front, smiling tightly and shuffling papers in a frantic kind of order. She started the meeting with a long introduction about how this vote wasn't about property seizure, but about ensuring that the spirit of the community remained alive and inclusive. She framed everything as a misunderstood effort, a noble goal twisted by a small but loud faction of contrarians. She never mentioned me by name, but her eyes kept darting in my direction. When she opened the floor for comments, I stood. I didn't raise my voice or call her names. I simply asked 3 questions. First, how many proxy votes were activated without direct consent? Second, whether the board was aware that the county had no record of any beautification initiative submitted or approved. And third, whether she could explain the presence of influencer guests on my private property, which she had encouraged without disclosing its actual legal status. Before she could respond, Victor stood and introduced himself. He explained that he had reviewed the documents as an impartial party and was prepared to share his findings. The room went dead silent as he read a summary of the voting discrepancies, the altered proxy settings, and the fabricated project documentation. He also handed out printed copies of signed statements from affected residents, including the one from David, the state registrar, confirming the cabin's exemption from HOA control. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming the meeting was being hijacked by outsiders, but someone from the board raised a motion to vote on freezing all amendments pending full audit review. It passed. Then another board member raised a motion to suspend Karen as acting president during the investigation. It passed too. Karen stood frozen, her voice caught between outrage and panic as the room she once controlled with charm and intimidation turned against her with surgical precision. There were no cheers, no gloating, just a silence so loud it made her footsteps echo as she stormed out. A few minutes later, the meeting ended. People filed out quietly, talking in hushed tones, some shaking my hand or nodding in silent thanks. No one said her name. They didn't need to. The silence did it for them. In the week following Karen's collapse at the HOA meeting, the neighborhood took on an eerie stillness. The kind of quiet that hangs in the air when a dominant presence disappears and people are unsure whether to breathe freely or brace for the return. The meeting had ended her iron grip, but it hadn't erased the consequences of her actions, and no one was entirely certain whether she'd accept her fate or try to rise again under a new title or excuse. The board had appointed an interim president, a soft-spoken man named Elliot, who once spent more time planting heirloom tomatoes than managing anything remotely political. His first move was to pause all HOA initiatives until a formal review of procedures, voting protocols, and community decision-making structures could be completed. It was the right move, and it helped calm some of the tension that had been crackling through backyards and mailbox clusters. But beneath that surface, everyone knew that things weren't fully settled. There was a lingering question that no one had dared say out loud. What would happen to Karen now? The answer came in the form of a whistleblower. It wasn't me. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't even someone I knew well. It was Linda, a longtime board member and treasurer who had sat through every meeting with a pleasant smile and a notepad filled with carefully written minutes. She was the kind of woman everyone trusted because she never raised her voice and always brought lemon bars to community picnics. But apparently even lemon bars have a limit. One evening, she knocked on my door carrying a folder and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. She didn't sit when I offered. She just opened the folder and laid out 3 documents. The first was a record of an HOA debit card transaction used to reserve a beachfront event tent for the day Karen tried to commandeer my cabin. The second was a receipt for promotional materials, flyers, pamphlets, and signage that bore the HOA logo, but had never been approved by a board vote. The third was a list of payments made to a local contractor for property assessments that were supposedly carried out to determine communal access need. The contractor, a family friend of Karen's, none of these expenditures had been disclosed to the rest of the board. Linda had reviewed the accounts after the vote because something hadn't sat right with her. What she found was a trail of quiet abuses, small enough to slip under the radar, but frequent enough to reveal a pattern. It wasn't just about power. It had been about money, too. Linda wanted to come forward, but feared retaliation. I told her the tide had already turned, and the neighborhood wouldn't back Karen now that the truth was surfacing piece by piece. Together, we drafted a report that would be sent to the rest of the board along with supporting evidence. We didn't attach names. We let the documents speak. Within days, Elliot called for an emergency board session, this time with 2 external auditors present. Residents from a neighboring community who had experience in HOA ethics reviews and had volunteered their time to help us get clean. The meeting was quiet, professional, and devastating. The findings were presented without drama, but the weight of them was undeniable. Karen had used HOA funds for personal events, misrepresented projects to funnel work to associates, and bypassed approval procedures repeatedly under the guise of community improvement. She had twisted the bylaws to her own ends, selectively enforced rules against those who opposed her, and tried to rewrite policy to legitimize what she had already done in secret. But the final blow came when the auditors reviewed the digital voting irregularities. With the IT specialist's log files and a handful of resident statements, it became clear that Karen had tampered with the voting process. Proxy votes had been fabricated. Deadlines had been altered mid-process. Notifications had been intentionally misdirected. It wasn't just unethical. It bordered on criminal. Elliot sent a formal letter to Karen advising her that the board would be referring the matter to a legal review panel for potential civil action. She never responded directly, but 2 days later, a moving truck appeared in front of her house. By evening, she was gone. Her departure wasn't celebrated. It wasn't the kind of victory that called for applause. It felt more like the end of a fever. The neighborhood breathing a cautious sigh of relief as the toxins slowly left the system. People began speaking to one another more freely again. Conversations returned to lawn clippings, dog leashes, and the weather, but the scars remained. Some neighbors who had backed Karen out of fear or confusion still kept their distance from those who had opposed her. Others tried to pretend none of it had happened, as if the entire saga could be folded up and filed away under HOA miscellaneous. But there were those like Paul and Linda who understood that real healing would take more than silence. So we decided to do something different. Instead of holding another official HOA meeting, we organized a neighborhood barbecue on the beach. One open to everyone with no speeches, no votes, no hidden agendas. Just food, music, and a chance to remember what living in this place used to feel like. People came in droves bringing casseroles and folding chairs, kids in sandals and dogs on leashes, laughing and mingling in a way I hadn't seen in months. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else lit a fire pit. For the first time in a long while, the beach didn't feel like contested land. It felt like home again, and that meant everything. As the sun began to set, casting long golden streaks over the waves, Paul walked up next to me and handed me a cold soda. He nodded toward the line of sand leading up to my cabin, now free of flags, cameras, or angry tourists. He asked if I'd finally thought about putting in that hammock we joked about months ago. I told him, maybe, but probably not yet. He grinned and said, baby steps. I looked around at the faces, at the laughter, and thought maybe we were finally getting back to normal. But as always, the story hadn't quite reached its end. That following Monday, a sleek black car pulled up outside the community center. A woman in a blue blazer stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and a stack of paperwork. She introduced herself to Elliot and said she was from the State Property Regulation Office. Someone had referred a complaint, not against Karen, but against the HOA itself. Apparently, the vote tampering, fraudulent amendments, and misused funds had triggered a state-level review. There would be interviews, document requests, possibly penalties. Elliot looked stunned. Linda looked relieved. I just looked tired. The irony wasn't lost on me. After everything, it wasn't just Karen who would be held accountable. It was the entire system that had let her operate unchecked. But maybe that was the only way to really change things. Not by replacing one tyrant with another, but by shining light into every corner of the machine and forcing it to work the way it should have all along. 3 weeks passed without a single HOA email. No surprise flyers in the mailbox, no strange guests lingering at the edge of my property, pretending to be tourists interested in architectural symmetry. It was almost unnerving how quickly peace settled over the community after months of chaos, like the eye of a storm had finally moved on, and left behind only broken lawn signs and half-healed trust. Elliot had taken to his new role with an almost reluctant wisdom, less a leader and more a caretaker tasked with sweeping up someone else's mess. He communicated clearly, avoided drama, and most importantly, stopped pretending that leadership required controlling everyone's patio furniture or demanding pre-approval for the color beige. People slowly returned to neighborly routines, sharing leftover muffins, complaining about garbage pickup, asking politely before borrowing ladders. It wasn't perfect, but it was calm. And in a place like ours, calm was a treasure. Still, there was one last thing I needed to do before I could call the chapter closed. Not for the neighborhood, for myself. It happened on a Thursday morning as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching the breeze tug at the dune grass like it was trying to smooth out all the tension that had been stitched into the sand. A delivery van pulled up and out stepped a man with a clipboard and a small wooden box about the size of a toolbox. He confirmed my name, had me sign, and drove off without much conversation. Inside the box was a custom engraved plaque. Nothing flashy, nothing grandiose, just a piece of bronze polished to a soft shine with a single line etched into it. Private, not for HOA guests. I attached it to the gatepost leading down to the beach, not as a taunt, not as revenge, but as a reminder, a line drawn not in anger, but in clarity. It was mine, and it had always been mine. The sea had no governing board, and neither did my cabin. Karen had tried to rewrite the story, but the tide had erased every false word. Later that afternoon, Paul stopped by with a grin that stretched too far to be innocent. He handed me a thick manila envelope stamped with a state seal and said, "You might want to read this somewhere comfortable." Inside were official state findings from the Property Regulation Office review. The audit had been completed ahead of schedule. The state concluded that while the HOA had committed no criminal offenses, there had been enough procedural violations and bylaw manipulation to warrant intervention. They issued a formal censure against the HOA as a whole, recommended full re-election of board positions within 90 days and suspended all HOA voting authority until new digital voting infrastructure could be implemented with third-party oversight. But that wasn't the most satisfying part. Buried deep in the final summary was a one-sentence note that read, Parcel ID 142-009B, also known as the beachfront cabin located at 211 Cass Lane, is hereby recognized as outside the jurisdiction of Seawatch Shores Homeowners Association with legal immunity from all present and future communal governance authority. It was over. Not just the fight, but the ambiguity. The cabin was now fully and legally untouchable. Karen could return in disguise with a clipboard and a fake smile, but the law had spoken louder than her newsletter ever could. That weekend, as if the universe wanted to reward the neighborhood for surviving the Civil War without torches and pitchforks, the weather turned impossibly perfect. Clear skies, salt, crisp wind, and sunsets so gold they looked like fire melting across the waves. I hosted a quiet gathering, just a few people who had stood beside me during the madness. Paul, Linda, Elliot, even David the state registrar, who happened to be passing through town again and decided to stop by with a bottle of wine. We grilled seafood, passed around folding chairs, and laughed at the absurdity of the summer that almost tore a community in two over one woman's thirst for control. There was no bitterness in the air, just relief. Elliot told me he planned to run again during the re-election, not because he wanted power, but because he didn't trust anyone else not to ruin the calm we had fought so hard to earn. Linda said she'd stay on as treasurer, but only if she never had to touch the HOA credit card again. Paul, ever the realist, just asked if we could amend the bylaws to ban the phrase coastal unity from any future communications. Everyone agreed. Toward the end of the evening, as the fire pit burned low and the sea whispered against the shore like it was telling old secrets, I stood for a moment alone at the gate near my plaque. The breeze tugged gently at the edges of the engraved letters, and for a moment I thought about how close it all came to being stolen. Not just the physical space, but the peace that came with knowing something was yours and didn't need to be defended daily with documents and legal threats. Karen had almost rewritten that truth with a fake smile and a fake vote. But the truth, I realized, is quieter than the noise people make trying to bury it. And when it surfaces, it does so with a quiet finality that nothing can undo. I didn't hate her. Not anymore. She had been exposed, unseated, and erased not through vengeance, but through light. In the end, her downfall wasn't about me. It was about her need to be more important than the truth. And truth doesn't bend just because someone talks louder. The neighborhood, for all its flaws and eccentricities, had passed through something rare. We had been tested not by fire or flood, but by something more subtle and corrosive. Ego disguised as leadership, and we had survived, changed, maybe a little bruised, but intact. The beach was still the beach. The people still cared, even if some had stayed silent for too long, and the cabin was still mine. It would always be mine. Long after names changed on mailboxes and new families moved in with fresh dreams and clean yards, the cabin would remain at the edge of the world, watching the tide roll in and out without ever asking for permission. In the days that followed, I watched from my porch as life resumed its slow rhythm. Children chased kites down the shore again. Couples walked hand in hand without glancing over their shoulders. The HOA bulletin board, once cluttered with mandates and threats disguised as suggestions, now bore a simple message in Elliot's handwriting that said, "Thank you for your patience. Real change takes time. The rest is up to us." And just beneath it, someone had taped a small photo of my plaque, like a quiet tribute to the battle we'd all just witnessed. I never found out who. I didn't ask. Some victories don't need parades or speeches. Sometimes the most meaningful win is waking up, walking outside, and realizing no one's trying to take what you've already earned. And so I stayed, not because I needed to defend anything anymore, but because there was nothing left to defend, only to enjoy, only to share when I chose how I chose. The sea remained unchanged and patient, waiting for someone to listen instead of control. And I did every morning with coffee, silence, and the sound of waves tapping gently at the shore like they too were glad that Karen was gone.